Jonathan Adams is a conservation biologist and program director for conservation knowledge and communities for the Nature Conservancy in Washington, D.C. In addition to his book, The Future of the Wild, he previously co-authored The Myth of Africa, Conservation Without Illusion, and he co-edited Precious Heritage, the Status of Biodiversity in the United States. Welcome, Jonathan, to Cambridge Forum.
Thanks very much, Wayne, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. Think big. That, I think, really captures the crux of what we need to do. We need to think big in space and time and think big in terms of hope. And I think, in fact, that thinking big provides enormous reason for being hopeful about the future of the wild, not only in this country but elsewhere. And that may seem like a bit of a paradox, given the challenges we face and given how hard it is even to preserve the small spaces that we now treasure, the small wildernesses that we value so much. But I think that thinking big is the only way that we can really be successful. And I have a couple stories that I hope illustrate why I think there's reason for at least cautious optimism for the future of the wild. And The Future of the Wild really is a book about hope. And the first story is not in the book, actually, because it took place too recently to be in the book, but it's also too important to not at least mention, and that is the rediscovery of the ivory-billed woodpecker. As many of you are aware, I'm sure, the ivory-bill has been feared extinct for some 60 years. There had been rumors of an ivory bill in Louisiana, perhaps one in Cuba, but nothing had been really confirmed until last year when scientists in an area of Arkansas known as the Big Woods had documented evidence of at least one ivory bill. And there are a couple pieces of this story that I think are particularly important. First is, it's hard to imagine a more hopeful story than this. This is a rebirth. This is a species back from the dead. But more than that, it is in a lot of ways a testament to what you could call, and I don't intend to be pejorative here, old-fashioned conservation. Basically taking land and setting it aside, protecting it from development. This has been the stock and trade of conservation for decades, not only at the Nature Conservancy, but across the conservation community. But it's also, in an interesting way, points out the difficulties of protecting land in that way as we move forward. I think in 10 years from now, when we look back on the rediscovery of the ivory bill, we'll see it as having taken place in the midst of a pretty dramatic transformation in the way we think about and do conservation. But that key tool of setting aside land will remain, but it's often effective in unexpected ways. I don't think anyone, when they were setting aside land in the big woods of Arkansas, had a rational expectation that they were going to find an ivory-billed woodpecker there. But there it is. And I think that brings up the question of what is the role of science in conservation, and how do we go about planning the next protected area or the network of protected areas that we need. And the other piece of the story about science in the ivory-billed woodpecker rediscovery is the ivory-bill was actually first sighted in Arkansas 2 years ago. And scientists took a year documenting this sighting. Number one, because they're good and careful scientists and wanted to be sure that they were right. And any announcement of dramatic as the rediscovery of a form, what was feared an extinct species, they couldn't just be guessing. And that is, I think, what we're going to have to do from here on in terms of conservation. If we're going to be credible, if we're going to be accountable, we're going to need to have the strongest possible scientific underpinning for what we do. And we are really beginning to develop a science that allows us to think big, provides the scientific tools for understanding how nature functions across far greater areas than we had ever considered working at before. And that is another, I think, enormously hopeful part of that story. Interestingly, the power of the ivory bill story has already reached far and wide. I recently heard that in remote Western Australia, some elders of an Aboriginal tribe there approached some Nature Conservancy staff who were working in the region, and they said, "We heard about your lost bird that was found." It's a hopeful sign, and it is a hopeful sign, but I think it's a lot more than that. The second story that I want to tell is in the book, and this takes place in southern Arizona, far southern Arizona, down by the Mexican border. And this is very hard, dry country. It is very difficult to make a living out there as a rancher, and that's what most of the families who live in the area are attempting to do, to ranch cattle. One of the ranchers who lives out there, a man named Warner Glenn, actually named his ranch Malpai, from the Spanish, from Badland. And that's a pretty accurate description. It is very, very arid and can only have a few cattle. And most of the people who are attempting to make a living out there have to do something else in addition to raising cattle if they want to stay out there. They run road graders, they drive school buses. Warner Glenn guides hunting trips. He grew up as a hunter with his father defending their herds against mountain lions. And one day about 10 years ago, he was out with a client hunting mountain lions, and they came across what Glenn believed was the paw print of a large male mountain lion. And they were on mules, and they had some hunting dogs with them. So they started to track this lion, and it led them up these steep ridges, down the other side, across the valleys, back up other steep ridges, and Glenn was amazed. He'd tracked a lot of mountain lions, and he'd never seen one that could go that far and that fast and not give out. And after several hours of this, he could tell by the barks of the way his dogs were barking that they had bayed the cat in some trees or on a bluff. And they finally caught up to the dogs, and Glenn tied his mules up to a clump of trees, and he came around the other side to get a look at this lion that had led him on this wild chase. And he found himself face to face, not with a mountain lion at all, but with a jaguar, a large male jaguar in the prime of life, mad as hell, full of fight, about to take some pieces out of his dogs. And remember, this is a very remote part of southern Arizona. It is the kind of place where it would not be at all unusual for a rancher and a hunter brought face to face with a rare and endangered species like that to say, I don't want an endangered species anywhere near my land. I don't want to have to deal with all the things that come with having an endangered species around. I don't want the regulations. I would rather this problem just went away. And he might be tempted, as they say out west, to shoot, shovel, and shut up. But Warner Glenn didn't do that. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his camera, and he took the first pictures ever of a live wild jaguar in the United States. Prior to that, there had been 63 wild jaguars sighted in the United States, and 62 of them had been shot. And I had a chance to ask Warner Glenn about this a couple of years ago when I met him, about why he did that. Why did he reach for his camera and not his gun? And keep in mind, we're about as different as two people could possibly be. Warner Glenn is fifth-generation Arizonan. He's a rancher, he's a hunter, politically conservative. I'm this liberal Eastern environmentalist, conservation biologist, writer. And I asked him why he did that, and he just looked at me and he smiled and he said, it was a jaguar. And the way he said it and the awe that was still in his voice many years after the fact made me think, maybe we're not that different after all. And that to me is enormously hopeful, because in the final analysis, conservation really isn't about science, as important as I think science is, or about politics, or about laws and regulations. It's about values. It's about what do people care about, and what do people care about enough to protect. And it's not my values, or the values of the Nature Conservancy, or your values alone. It's also the values of people like Warner Glenn, ranchers, hunters, farmers, people who we have often, with some justification, seen as the enemy, seen as opposed to conservation. But Warner Glenn's comments and his actions speak more than his comments, actually. He's already begun with his neighbors, all of whom are ranchers, to attempt to protect 800,000 acres of land in southern Arizona so that Someday he might be out again with his mules and he might see that jaguar again. And it's that understanding and that empathy and that feeling, what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, that attachment that we often have lost, or we've lost the understanding that it is an important value for people who we have thought to have lost that. And I think that there is, in the politics that have arisen over these, in the debates that have created enormous gulfs between communities of conservationists and communities of the rural communities who live on the land, that I think must be overcome. We need to find the common ground and find the common values. And if not the common values, at least the common problems that we can address together. And this is not to say that this is going to be an easy process. The example that I use in the book is from, one of the examples is from a place called the Big Hole River in western Montana. And this is a place that could have been your classic real conflict over conservation. This has all of the elements. There's an endangered species of fish in the river. There are people who want to build second homes in the area. The Big Hole is one of the great trout streams in North America. And there are ranching communities who live along the river who draw down the water for their livestock or for their hay fields. This has really all the earmarks of a battle. And in fact, when a group tried to bring everyone together, bring all those parties together to see if they could find some common ground, the first meetings really were a lot of yelling and screaming. But over time, those folks have come to understand that yes, they have common problems, and yes, they can work together on those common problems. And in fact, they've come to recognize that they really do share a lot of the same values and have much more in common than they had ever believed before. And I think that we need to build on that and put it in the context of a scale of conservation that is at the same scale of the problems that we face. And that is where thinking big, I think, really becomes important. When you think about something like the ivory bill, or you think about the jaguar that Warner Glenn saw, that jaguar wasn't living in Arizona. Almost undoubtedly, he was living far to the south in the Sierra Madres and had come up north, possibly looking for new territory. So we're talking hundreds of miles and across an international border. And that's the scale at which we need to think. And the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker is a similar story. The problems facing the ivory bill are not restricted to the Cache River National Wildlife Refuge in Arkansas, where it was just seen. The problems are stemming from the fact that what used to be 50 million acres of southern bottomland hardwood forest, the preferred habitat for the ivory bill, is now 10 million acres. And that is a scale that we are only beginning to understand scientifically, politically, culturally. How can we deal with problems at that scale? But once you look at that scale, once you step back from thinking about an area like the Cache River National Wildlife Refuge, or even a major park like Yellowstone, you begin to realize that a lot of the land that we see as important biologically is never going to be protected in a traditional sense. It's going to be used by people in one way or another. So how can we begin to put the puzzle together so that we can have both communities, human communities that are able to use land and use it well, but also have land that is protected for things like the ivory bill and things like the jaguar that maybe someday will come back and begin to repopulate southern Arizona. And if we can start to think about a shared vision, one landscape at a time, what is this landscape going to look like in 100 years? And if that vision is broad enough to include not just the parks and protected areas, but also the places where people are going to be living and working, then I think, and if that vision can be informed by science, then I think we have the foundation for making a really lasting conservation, a conservation that is really worthy of our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Jonathan Adams discussing Can We Preserve the Wilderness? And I'd like to start the Q&A with a cue of my own. You've emphasized the importance of bringing good science to that conversation about how to conserve and how much to conserve. And I was struck by that throughout your book, particularly when that science was brought to a table where good plain folk like Warner Glenn, who I've had the honor to meet and talk with as well, are sitting. And I think one of the challenges we face in today's age is, first of all, a suspicion of science, and second of all, an incomprehension of a lot of what scientists say. And I guess I would like to know your thoughts about how the conservation biologists sitting across from the Warner Glenns were able to present that science in a way that could not only be understood by just plain folks, but embraced by them and thus incorporated into this shared vision.
I think the main message of the new science that we're really beginning to develop in conservation is about how do the things that we do every day affect the things that we think are important in terms of nature and wilderness and wildlife. What are the consequences of our actions in terms of what we want our landscape, our neighborhood, what have you, to look like? So when Warner Glenn and his neighbors say that what they want to do is they want to stay on the land, that is their value. They want to maintain a ranching lifestyle. And conservation scientists are able to say, well, this is what is happening in southern Arizona. These are the consequences of the incredibly rapid growth of Tucson. This is what's going to happen if we don't begin to act on controlling the sprawl and are not able to set aside land, but set aside land carefully enough that an area that is enormous in terms of square miles, how does that hold together? What are the ecological processes that hold the land together, and how can we keep that together but still allow the ranching to continue at some level? What do we need to do in terms of having fire, reintroducing fire to the ranch land in southern Arizona? And this is, talk about reintroducing fire, and a lot of people, of course, get pretty nervous. But the ranchers understand that that's a natural process that has to occur if they're going to be able to continue to graze, because it revitalizes the grassland. So then you have an ally in the ranchers who can then work with the government agencies who have for years put out every fire that started. And so you can begin to put things together. And what you get is science provides really the cover of the jigsaw puzzle box. What is the big vision for, say, southern Arizona? What are the things that are important in terms of the ecology that need to be preserved, and how can people fit into it? And then people begin to understand what their role is, and they begin to be invested in understanding what their role is and what the consequences of their actions are.
Great, thanks. Again, you're listening to Jonathan Adams discussing Can We Preserve the Wilderness, and we welcome questions from the audience. For those of you who have them, please line up at the microphone, and we can take questions. In that event, I'll ask another one. I was struck by the mention of one of the biologists in your book by using the term, and I think I'm capturing this right, reconciliation ecology. And without going into its definition, please read Jonathan's book, it's good. Basically, it was a term that recognizes that the old value held by more traditional conservationists of setting aside nature in some pristine and violet state just wasn't possible anymore, given the far-reaching effects that we're having on our planet, whether it's global warming, whether it's the spread of invasive species, and so on. And so there's a new way to think about conservation and ecology, employing this term reconciliation. And I guess, given the hopeful tone of your book, that term reconciliation seemed to me to be a bit of a compromise, and I'd be interested to hear your remarks on how you interpret that discipline of reconciliation ecology in light of our goal of preserving all the cogs and wheels, as Aldo Leopold has said.
The reconciliation ecology is a term that an ecologist named Michael Rosenzweig, who I believe is at University of Arizona, has coined. And it is a compromise in some sense, but it's important to realize what he's attempting to do. And the idea is that, assuming we have in any given landscape some areas that are set aside permanently and protected and are as inviolate as we can make them, and then we have other areas that are going to be intensively used, industrially used or heavily developed, and then there's a wide range of land use in between those two ends of the spectrum. And what Rosenzweig is arguing is that within that area there is a tremendous amount that we can do to promote and foster natural communities that might not look exactly like the communities that were on that land 200, 300, 400 years ago, but that are nevertheless vibrant natural communities that support a wide array of species. And he's attempting, I think, to bring attention to all of the things we can do both to restore those habitats and perhaps, again, not restore them to 100% of what we might ideally imagine, but restore them pretty significantly so that they continue to function. And it gets back to this notion of how are we keeping really large areas together and functioning ecologically. And that requires that we have some land that is used well. And reconciliation really is about the ecology of using land well in a way that some species, at least, other than humans, can continue to thrive there. And it's something that Rosenzweig has been promoting. It might be a little premature to call it a specialty, but I think it's something that more and more people are beginning to understand is another tool in how we do conservation at a scale that's really relevant to the way we live.
So it's not really a conservation compromise, it's really applying conservation and the disciplines of conservation biology more smarter. Smarter
and everywhere. Mm-hmm. And not thinking just that these are the protected areas and this is what's important for conservation and over here we have everything else. We have lots of land in between, and that's the land that's going to be incredibly important, especially as we deal with the consequences of climate change. Right. If we have hard borders of our parks, then we're in real trouble. I mean, we can't think about the current borders of Yellowstone, because the current borders of Yellowstone probably are not going to be the borders of Yellowstone in 100 years. Yellowstone's probably going to move. And if we allow West Yellowstone, if you've ever been there, you know what the horror show that West Yellowstone has become. If we allow that to go right up to the border and all we have are motels and strip malls right up to the border of Yellowstone, then that's a problem. Reconciliation ecology is how do we use land in a way that not just people can survive there.
Right. A question from the audience.
Yes, I think that point actually sort of answers part of my question, but I'm wondering, I like your idea about thinking bigger about things, and I'm wondering if you have any ideas. You know, we have Cape Wind going on here, and you know, I'm a hiker in the Adirondacks and in the White Mountains, and I'm a sailor out in the ocean, and yet, you know, when I think about I want to take responsibility for the consequences of turning on the lights, which I do every day. So I'm all for the wind, and you know, but I hear the mountain people saying, you know, oh, we can't have wind towers across, you know, our mountain ranges, which is where the wind happens to be. You know, so I understand the business, you know, it needs to be affordable to build them, and there needs to be a good wind source, but, you know, I'm just wondering how to sort of, you know, justify these two things, that open spaces are wonderful. I love being far away from civilization, and yet I also think it's important to take responsibility for global warming and our energy usage and so on. Any ideas?
I think part of the reason that being able to think big is so important is that we can't really understand where to put those wind farms unless we're thinking big, because we don't understand what the really important areas are in terms of how an area functions. So we have to be able to think big and say, this area here, really, we can't put wind farms here. And we have to understand that that's part of the equation. It's not that every place is suddenly open to every possible use. We have to say, well, this part, maybe some of those mountains, we can't put wind farms there because of the way the natural communities there are structured, because of the way people are currently using it, or what have you. But then you can say, if we can't put it there, where can we put them? We're understanding that people are going to use land, and we do have the need for alternative sources of energy. Given that, where should we go? Where should we put the wind farm so that it does the least amount of damage ecologically, but provides some benefits? And previously, before we began to think at that scale, it would have been a shot in the dark. It would have been whoever came up with the most compelling plan on that day that could have won the discussion. Say, well, we'll put it here because it's convenient, and not understood that, well, maybe there was a better place to put it from an ecological perspective if we look at an area of, say, 10,000 square miles. And that's the scale at which we need to think about all of these questions, both from a pure conservation perspective, where are we putting the parks, but also where are we putting the towns, where are we putting the industries, where are we putting the wind farms. So I think that principle is one we need to reinforce at every opportunity, that the scale needs to be commensurate with the issues that we're confronting. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I disagree with it.
Okay.
Your previous question, you said, the boundaries of Yellowstone aren't what they're going to be in with erosion and, obviously I think we need them out. We need wind turbines out in the ocean right now.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of timing and.
Right, and I don't disagree with that. I think you're right. The question is, where's the best place to put them? And how do we go about deciding where the best place to put them is? And it's that scale. Okay.
So I guess it seems like a difficult question. Where is the best place?
Another question.
Yes. During the last few years, I've learned more about global warming than I ever wanted to know. How do we conserve the environment when the climate is expected to change and when the forecasts for that change are very uncertain, depending mostly on human behavior?
And it's that uncertainty that I think requires us to build in enough flexibility so that as the climate changes, if we allow it, nature will find a new equilibrium. It may not look exactly the way it does today, but nature will find a new balance if we allow it. If we don't, if we are so constrained in terms of have we developed all the way up to the boundaries of Yellowstone or in any other park, that nature can't find a new equilibrium, then you have collapse. And so I think that in terms of, when thinking about global climate change, what is it that we're attempting to conserve? If we say that what we want to conserve is everything that we have as of right now, in its state as it is today, that might not be possible because climate is going to change. But can we allow nature to find that new equilibrium and preserve nature in some form, even though it's going to be somewhat different from what it is today? And that's the challenge, both from the conservation perspective of how do we plan for new nature reserves, how do we build in that flexibility so that the bison can migrate north, or whatever other species need to migrate in whichever direction. You're right, there's a lot of uncertainty in different places Species are going to migrate in different ways. So it's both doing conservation in a slightly different way, but also then there are all of the questions of how do we try to reduce the impact so that we're not dealing with truly catastrophic change, but hopefully more gradual change.
We used an interesting example. I mean, our environmental niches are now so fragmented that the bison can't migrate, and the trees can't migrate fast enough. The birds probably can, but without help, not much else in nature will be able to adapt.
I don't know if I would be that bleak. I think there is certainly fragmentation is a tremendously challenging problem, but I don't think that we've reached the state yet that nothing will be able to migrate in the face of climate change. I think there is a good deal of flexibility still in the system. I think we're nearing the point that flexibility is going to go away, and we're going to get to a point of rigidity, and then in the face of that, then you could have real catastrophic changes. I mean, I think in terms of the bison, I think there may be room for bison to migrate north. If you look at what's going on in the northern Great Plains, and this gets back to the wind farm question, there's a lot of interest in putting wind farms on the northern Great Plains at the same time we bring back migratory bison herds, because those two things could probably coexist. And I think it's a very difficult question, and we don't know enough yet about exactly which communities are going to need to migrate, how far, and in which way. But I think we need to look at that fragmentation, and again, the fragmentation at the scale we're talking about doesn't become really evident until you begin to examine this at the scale of tens of thousands of square miles, which we're only beginning to understand how to do.
Yes.
Following that thread, since you're full of personal optimistic stories, do you have any personal optimistic stories on global warming? Could use a couple.
Personal optimistic stories?
Well, or individuals that you referred to before.
The shorter answer is no. I mean, I think that, but it's sort of implicit in a lot of the stories in the book, because I mean, if you think about what Warner Glenn and his neighbors are attempting to do in the Malpai region, that is work at a scale and at a both temporal and spatial scale that could provide you a system that is resilient enough to deal with climate change. I mean, it's a unique system in a lot of ways ecologically, but if they are successful and they are able to resist the spread of Tucson and Sierra Vista and other towns in southern Arizona, then I think there is a real opportunity to preserve that southern desert ecosystem, in large part because they have 800,000 acres to work with, plus an enormous amount of land on the Gray Ranch in New Mexico that allows you those flexible boundaries. And they haven't drawn, and in cooperation with a lot of government agencies, they've been able to sort of get away from really hard and fast boundaries as to what can be done on private land versus public land. I think that sort of cooperation is the kind of thing we're going to need to do for any region if we're going to be able to adjust to climate change. We're not going to be able to rest on the existing boundaries or the existing notions of how land is used on one side of a line versus another. Those lines are all going to have to be redrawn.
I'd like to ask, go back to a more local, provincial question. It's easy to imagine, or easier, I suppose, to imagine thinking big when you're talking about bison migratory patterns in the West and Yellowstone and Yosemite. Here in eastern Massachusetts, we look at our wildernesses, tend to be small, spotted areas of land. Is there a way for us to think big? And what does that mean for us? I mean, land here is largely taken, much of it's fixed. Does thinking big mean rolling back what most of the people would term progress? Or is there, is there a solution here? And what would it look like?
Yes, we can think big anywhere. And I think we have to think big everywhere. And the challenges are certainly more significant here in the East, where the fragmentation that we were talking about before has progressed much more, to a much more dramatic degree than elsewhere. But still, you need to be able to step back and think not just of the existing small parcels of land that people value, the little park that's nearby, that is incredibly important to that community. You need to be able to see how that park fits into a broader system of parks, of reserves, and of other land uses, and understand how to keep that park really vibrant. And yes, there may be an opportunity in some cases to roll back some progress. In places where you have industries that have moved out, can you rehabilitate the brownfields? And again, this gets back to the reconciliation ecology question. What can you bring back? And how can you begin to fit things together? If you have, in some places, certainly in the East, you have systems that are already on the verge of, fragmenting to such a degree that they're going to fall apart. To put them back together, we need to be able to see what are the systems that really need to be restored. And I mean, that is an enormously important field now, called restoration ecology, which is something that Rosenzweig was attempting to contrast when he brought up reconciliation ecology. Restoration ecology is really putting back together what's been broken. And that tends to be fairly small scale at this point. I think we can scale that up to think about, at the level of, eastern Massachusetts. What places would you really have to say, this is really important to restore because this is an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And so the principle of thinking big applies regardless of how much land is in public hands. I mean, you think about a project that Dave Foreman, who we were talking about earlier, is involved in what he calls mega corridors, which are huge stretches of land, and there are 4 of them. One goes up the west coast, one goes down through the Isthmus of Panama, and one cuts across basically north of here in the boreal forests. And they begin to look at what are the important pieces of land and put together the map of how you put together a network of reserves to maintain this area. And they were working in New Hampshire, and someone said to them, well, we can't really think big in New Hampshire. The biggest landowner here only owns 2,000 acres. And the response was, well, it's a little harder. You have to put this together 2,000 acres at a time rather than 10,000 acres at a time. But that doesn't mean that those 2,000 acres still aren't going to be critical. And understanding why they're critical requires you to be able to think at that scale. So the principle applies regardless of the amount of land you have on hand.
Another question?
First of all, on global warming, there was an article on the front page, front page article in yesterday's Wall Street Journal on French nuclear power, according to which the facts still aren't in on global warming. I couldn't believe it. I thought at least the news section of the Wall Street Journal had finally come around on this point, but evidently not. I came in a little late. It sounds like there's some fairly sophisticated analysis that you've been laying out. So these questions are offered in the light of some comments I may have missed, and if they're relevant, if you can fit them in to what you've been talking about, please do. First of all, many of us live in urban areas and don't get out. I mean, albeit there are these hybrid environments. In fact, most everything is, I guess, but most of us don't spend a lot of time in wildernesses, vast wildernesses, those that still remain. I think of them as being out in the West. And I've driven through but haven't spent time there much myself. So my first question is, who's doing good work to get people from the disproportionate number of people who are living in cities to get out and appreciate and become a political informed constituency for wildernesses? And secondly, you sort of alluded to, at least in the part that I heard, some of the pressures. Could you maybe be a little more specific on the industries, mining, logging, and also the commercialization that I think you were at least alluding to in terms of encroachment of strip malls and the like. And what are some of the specific battles where some victories could, from your point of view, sensible victories could be cut out in some of those areas?
Okay. In terms of who's doing good work, in terms of getting people from the urban areas out, the example that comes to mind immediately is there's a group based in Tucson called the Sky Islands Wilderness Network that has done amazing work in bringing people out to the Sky Islands, which are these isolated mountain ranges across southern Arizona, and really create a committed constituency of people who get out and work the land and get out and do things like take apart decommissioned logging roads and to try to restore area, do trail work, do bird counts, do that sort of thing. And they have been, not just the Sky Island Wilderness Network, but also other groups in and around Tucson have been so successful that 2 years ago there was a bond bill up in Tucson. And I don't know if you've ever been to Tucson, you know that it's really got the chance to become this sprawling, out of control monster of a city. You can practically stand on the borders of Tucson and measure its growth in miles per hour. It's zooming into the Sonoran Desert and into the foothills of the Sky Islands. And partly in response to work of people like the Sky Islands Wilderness Network, people in Tucson really stood up and said, that's not what we want. That's not what we want the future of our community to be. And they passed a bond bill for $270 million, I think, to buy land and set it aside in Pima County. And Pima County, just for reference, is about 10,000 square miles. That's about the size of New Hampshire. So it's a huge area. And in order to decide where they're going to spend this money, they're taking a lot of the science that we were talking about that's saying what are the important areas and how do we fit Pima County together in ecological terms. So here you have a community that has really stood up and said, this isn't what we want our community to be like. We value the Sonoran Desert, we value the Sky Islands, and here's the money to actually go ahead and preserve it, and here's the science that we hope we can draw on to make some really good choices. So there are other examples like that. I mean, I can't give you one here in the East, but I'm sure they exist. Now, your second question, in terms of what are the industries, who are the culprits here? It's interesting because in the West, at least, the culprits are the three you mentioned: logging, mining, and agriculture. And those are increasingly dinosaurs of industries in the West. More and more in places like in and around Bozeman, Montana, Gallatin County, you have the politics are absolutely dominated by those three industries. 60%, I think, of the representatives in the Montana legislature are connected to one of those three industries. Those three industries together account for about 10% of the economy of Montana. So you have this dramatic shift in what people are actually doing in Montana. And they're moving to Montana because of the natural amenities. That's why they're going there. They're not going there to become timber barons or coal barons. And I think we are reaching a tipping point in the power of those industries over land use decisions, particularly in the West, but I think more broadly. And I think that the recent appointment of Kempthorne to be the new Secretary of Interior is, I'm hoping, the last gasp of that approach, because he's very much tied to those three industries and from Idaho. But if you look at the economics, they are going in entirely the opposite direction. And those economics are going to drive real political and cultural change in the West. And drive it, I think, in a way that is going to be much more amenable to doing conservation, because people aren't going to want to move to Gallatin County, Montana at the rate they're moving there now if they can't go trout fishing, if they can't go up into the mountains and go skiing, if they can't go elk hunting. That's what's bringing them in, and it's I think that, I mean, those industries are still enormously powerful, but I think they are seeing change coming, and they're desperately clinging to what I hope is not a very long-lasting hold on those communities.
There's time I'd like to follow up.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah, right up to the
Well, one of the possible emerging industries is probably energy. I saw a film recently, a very interesting film, the main title of which is Homelands, about struggles of 4 different Native American tribes on environmental issues, one in Montana against the big coal company, and one, I think, in New Mexico involving uranium mining. So there's I mean, do you have comments on the two sides of, on the one hand, how you're linking up with tribal groups, Native Americans, on some of these issues and some of these battles, and also the role, the emerging role of energy corporations and how you see that as it's unfolding?
Yeah, energy is an interesting one. There is an enormous threat in many parts of the West called coal bed methane, which is tremendously destructive because it takes an enormous amount of water to get coal bed methane out of the coal seams. And it can really lead, the Powder River Basin in Wyoming is really sort of a horror at this point because of the amount of development of coal bed methane. And to the extent that it was developed so quickly and so heedlessly, that the backlash has been that a lot of counties in Montana are implementing zoning against coal bed methane. 5 years ago, if you'd mentioned the word zoning in most of Montana, they would have ridden you out of town. And that, I think, is indicative of the change that's going on. People see what can go wrong, and they realize that more and more their lifeblood is not going to be the energy industry. It's going to be people moving there because they want to live in a nice part of the world. And then on the other hand, conversely, you have a lot of wind power development, which has the potential, at least if it's done wisely, to be far less destructive. And there's a big effort now in eastern Montana, the western Dakotas, led by a group called the American Prairie Foundation, to put together a series of ranches covering millions of square miles. And this is land that's being depopulated. People are leaving the plains in droves. And a lot of ranchers who are struggling to stay on the land are looking to groups, conservation groups, and also to the wind power industry to work together to find a way that they can continue to ranch, perhaps lease some of their land for wind power, and also allow the reintroduction of bison. And I think that it sounds like a pipe dream. Millions of acres with migratory bison restored, but it's already happening. Just last Thanksgiving, they released a herd of 16 bison onto a newly purchased ranch in eastern Montana. And 16 bison sounds like a pretty small drop in the bucket, but these are unique because they're genetically pure wild bison. A lot of bison now are increasingly domesticated or have genes of domesticated species, and these don't. These retain the real pure wild bison. And this could be the seed population that could spread across a really huge area. So there are some real opportunities there. And I'm sorry, I forget your other... Native American. Yeah. There's increasingly efforts to work with all sorts of communities. And this is part of the question of, who are the people whose values are important. It's not just us, and it's not just the ranchers, it's also the Native American communities. And they have often been very protective of their sovereignty. And so have not been really part of the conversation. But that, I believe, is changing as well.
Please.
Thanks. I wanted to thank you for your explanation of reconciliation ecology. And I think what you did well is you pointed out the need to have big wild places in addition to sustainably managed places. And in particular in the Northeast, I think our region reflects an incredible story of recovery And that recovery is continuing right now, and everyone in the room has an opportunity to help write the end of that story. But oftentimes, as this man pointed out, wilderness is often thought of as a Western idea. And yet, in our region with less than 4% wilderness, we have incredible opportunity to protect big, wild places right here in our very region. So thank you for pointing that out. I wondered if you would tie this book to your last book and comment maybe on a story of hope in Africa. In light of global change and political instability, where are you seeing great land conservation hopeful stories in Africa?
I think in Africa and everywhere in the developing world, again, the same principles apply. The application of those principles is going to vary from the way they're applied here. But the notion of thinking at a scale that is commensurate with the activities of people needs, that's the way we're going to have to progress. And I think the most hopeful at this point place in a lot of ways is Namibia. Because here you have a country that has a reasonably stable, reasonably democratic government and is very interested in looking at the way land is owned and how we can deal with land tenure questions, because those often become critically important in how we do conservation in Africa, is who has the authority to make decisions about land. Frequently, it's restricted to the government, and that can be a problem when you have really lousy governments, which is unfortunately an all too common problem in Africa. In Namibia, what we're beginning to see are the creation of essentially conservancies, land conservancies in Namibia, where ownership and authority and responsibility, importantly responsibility for the land, is vested in tribal communities, not the government. And they are given the opportunity to decide how they're going to use the land within some boundaries set by, in a lot of cases, a lot of good science, how land is appropriate. I mean, in Namibia, the options for land use are relatively restricted given how dry it is. But can they use land in a way that they can earn some return, either by having tourism, having some limited hunting, in some cases having some cattle in some parts of their land, leaving other land aside, essentially having easements, in effect, across land in Africa, which is something very new and something I think very positive. There's also a program that I used to work with years ago in Zimbabwe called Campfire, which is a similar notion of vesting responsibility for land with local communities and giving them the authority and the return from managing their land well. I mean, Zimbabwe is so troubled politically, but interestingly, Campfire, the roots of Campfire are so deep now that it's still there. And if the government can sort itself out, I think Campfire will again blossom.
Thank you. Pat?
I think my question grows out of the last one, and I wonder if you could comment a little more broadly about the state of conservation movements internationally, and what kind of partnerships, what kind of work, for example, is the Nature Conservancy doing? How is it trying to apply some of these new ideas of reconciliation, conservation in less well-to-do parts of the world?
Right. As I said in the answer to the previous question, the application of the principles is different in developing countries, in large part because we're still attempting to really act on the values of the communities that live in the areas that are deemed important from a biological perspective. Because ultimately, if the people who live there aren't valuing that land, then the chances of really conserving it are pretty slim. But what I think we're finding is there is the desire to conserve that land. The challenge is the people there often have many other urgent, pressing needs that need to be addressed first. And so how do you do that at the same time that you're furthering conservation? And there it becomes, a very interesting challenge. And the question is, to what extent do conservation organizations like the Conservancy or others need to take on the challenge of basically rural development in developing world at the same time that we're attempting to do conservation? And this is a real flashpoint of debate at this point in the conservation community. And my take on it is that we can't do everything as the conservation community. And parks and protected areas can't really be expected to carry all of the burden of development. And this is what happened, say, 10 years ago when people began discussing what became called integrated conservation and development projects. The idea being you have a park which has been set aside, and you use the park essentially to drive development and drive economic growth of an area. And we're really finding that that is not a terribly effective strategy. But what we can do is, again, if we can think at a significant, broad enough scale, think about these are the protected areas, where is the economic development going on, where should it go on if we want to maintain the ecological processes, and what are the community's needs in terms of how can they become more effective voices for what they value. And this is often a problem, and it's a problem here too, where you have communities that become so fractured that they can't really be effective advocates for what they want, for what they value. And we saw this in Arizona. There were 2 communities that attempted to take on this sort of rural development and conservation projects themselves. One of them was enormously successful because it was a cohesive ranching community that all of the families had been there for a long time, and they were able to work together but also work with some new people who had moved in who had somewhat different perspectives, but they were able to find that real common approach to solving their problems and had a lot of success. A community maybe 20 miles away attempted to do the same thing and failed because there wasn't that cohesion in the community. And so in an interesting sense, conservation becomes an act of rebuilding community as well as rebuilding ecology. And it's not something we're very good at yet. We're really learning as we go. How do we rebuild a sense of community and a sense of belonging? But I think it's something we need to do.
If I could just interject a quick question. Is that what you just said, Jonathan, what you referred to in the book as the social capital necessary to bring to the table?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. Social capital, the notion that, in, say, a community like the Amish, real strong bonds among the people, real strong ties to the land, and the ability to act on what they believe is important. And you have where communities have a lot of social capital, then the kind of conservation approach that we've been talking about here really can take hold. Where you lack that, where you lack the cohesion, where you lack people's feelings of belonging, then it's much more difficult because you have people with vastly different beliefs, vastly different goals, vastly different needs. And can we rebuild social capital? And it's an open question, but I think it's one that you can begin addressing by asking people, what is it how do you see this landscape in 100 years? I think too often in conservation, the only question we ask of people when we meet them is, don't you see how terrible things are? And of course, that's not a question, it's a statement. But can we ask them, what is it that you value? What do you want to leave your grandchildren? And begin that conversation.
My question is, do you see any large-scale developers getting a conservation conscious? I am always thinking, money is the bottom line, and I don't think politicians are going to pay as much attention until the money is taken care of, and the money is where the developers are. And I'm wondering if you're noticing any social conscious developers that are willing to look at the question and work with conservationists, and in turn, because they're big money people, making a little push in the political area, which I think I always feel the politicians are going to ignore it until it's a huge groundswell from grassroots or money is going to be driving it.
Right.
So that's
I think that's absolutely right. And the example I think of is, again, in Pima County in Arizona. And that, the whole bond bill and the idea of using science, actually a lot of science developed by some folks at the Nature Conservancy to identify the places that need to be protected, the development community was very much involved in that. And they, in a lot of ways, made it possible, because when some of the big developers had bought into this process, they made it okay for other developers to also become part of it. And I think part of it is the development of social consciousness. Part of it is recognition that their money was really going to be dependent on being able to develop wisely, especially in some place like Arizona where water is going to be such a huge issue. And they recognize that the kind of science that they needed to decide where can we really focus growth that's going to be sustainable. I mean, that's what they're interested in. They want to continue to build housing developments. And also recognizing that the political winds were beginning to turn against them, that rampant, uncontrolled development was not going to be tenable anymore. And I would like to say that that's happening everywhere. It's not. But it's happening in more places. In Montana, there was a similar bond bill in Gallatin County. And I was talking to an economist out there, and he said that when they were going to go to the county commissioners, who were all, as I was saying before, tied to agriculture or mining, when they were going to go before the county commissioners to try to get this bond bill passed, these economists had all the charts and tables you could imagine about what the really important economic factors were, and they had all of their facts in a row. But what got them past the county commissioners was the fact that the biggest rancher in the county was behind their effort. And as this economist said to me, when they went to the meeting, this rancher just wore his biggest hat and his biggest belt buckle. And he said to the county commissioner, look, we've known each other for 30 years, and you're going to do this because this is good for agriculture. And that was it. And it's that sort of engagement, that sort of involvement that allows these things to happen that never would have happened 10 years ago.
I've got another question. And at the risk of sort of repeating myself, I'd like to revisit this science being brought to the table with stakeholders that may not be familiar with it question. I noted in your book 2 or 3 examples and a consistent theme that demonstrated that conservation biology, being such a relatively new discipline, is simply, at this point, unable to answer a lot of the questions, at least to the degree of certainty that a lot of people would like. And indeed, I think our society has become comfortable with in terms of basing decisions upon. Uncertainty or ambiguity seems to be a given in a lot of these situations, while at the same time there's enough science and enough data there to at least point people in the right direction. And you highlight in one example in particular, or state explicitly, that our society is inclined to look for the engineering kind of clarity in terms of its science, but we're just, in terms of conservation biology, not ready to be able to provide that yet. And I was interested in your thoughts about how that ambiguity was able to be accepted by people who, like county commissioners, for example, who are used to basing decisions on something much more, at least on the face of a piece of paper, certain than that.
It's a great challenge. It is really an ongoing process of educating decision makers that we don't have real hard and fast answers. Michael Soule, who is one of the founders of conservation biology, told me while I was working on the book that the answer to every question in ecology is I don't know or it depends, which is not a popular statement for a county commissioner. But interestingly, I think what you're beginning to see is a bit more comfort with the notion that we try to do something and as an experiment and see what we learn from that experiment. And this is going on at an enormous scale in the Everglades, where the Everglades Restoration Project is really a series of many hundreds of smaller projects, almost all of which begin with a scientific hypothesis of what the outcome is going to be. And that's a pretty radical departure from the way the Corps of Engineers, who built most of the works in the Everglades, have gone about their business. And the notion that they're becoming comfortable with that approach, that we really don't know what the effect of all these projects is going to be, what the Everglades is going to look like when we're done. But we're going to know a lot more about each one of them as each one of them runs its course, and we're going to be able to readjust as we go along, I think is a tremendously positive sign. It may be that they don't quite understand that that's what they're getting into. But I think that that is the message that I think is being brought to people more and more, that it's not that we don't know the answer and never will know the answer. It's that the process of finding the answer is going to be require a little bit more flexibility than they might have been comfortable with before. But I suspect that it's something much more acceptable to people now than it was just a few years ago.
Another question from the audience.
I was curious, in a broader sense, how the discipline of conservation biology, is there a tension or complementarity between, in that discipline, and what, some social scientists or economists look at the idea of, ecological services or replacement costs when they try to really quantify the big impacts on the environment?
I think there's a lot of complementarity between conservation biology and ecological economics and those approaches. I think the strength of conservation biology is the fact that it is intended to be very interdisciplinary and really bring in tools like that into the conservation solutions, and why it's somewhat different from the fields that it grew out of, particularly ecology. And that gets, again, to the question of scale. I mean, ecology has traditionally been a very fine scale endeavor. What can we measure and what can we replicate? Conservation biology is attempting to deal with questions of human behavior in a lot of cases that require a lot of the social sciences and economics. And there still is, I mean, it's not a perfectly happy marriage at this point. Bringing in the tools of social sciences into conservation biology leads some conservation biologists who really come from the ecology background to be uncomfortable that it's not tangible enough, it's not quantifiable enough. But I find it enormously powerful, especially if we can begin thinking about ecological economics and as a more effective way of thinking about economics than the standard economic theory. Then I think it's really much more applicable. And just on the way up here on the plane, I actually started reading a book called Timothy, or Notes of an Abject Reptile. It's a book by Verlin Klinkenborg, where he takes a classic in natural history called The Natural History of Selborne, which is in England. It was written in this mid-18th century. And he writes it from the perspective of a tortoise living in Selborne in 1740. So it's a very interesting approach, but it really struck me that this is the scale at which ecology has traditionally thought, the scale that a tortoise could easily traverse in a year. And that scale is not at all the scale that we're thinking about now in conservation biology. But the natural history of Selborne, in a lot of ways, informed ecology for several hundred years. And we're just beginning, I think, to emerge from that.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, hearing none, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you
for your remarks. Much appreciated.